Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Halloween H20 20 years later from 1998. I think the best thing to talk about with Halloween 20 years later is to talk about what Halloween, the film, and its legacy was in the 90s, which had a lot to do with Scream, which Scream heavily talks about the original Halloween film, despite being, directed by Wes Craven and stuff. Kevin Williamson, who wrote Scream, wrote Dawson's Creek, and did a lot of uncredited screenwriting on this, and is an executive producer, really loved the original Halloween. And this film was supposed to kind of bring things back, as Jamie Lee Curtis was probably the biggest she was as a movie star. In this, the problem with making a Halloween film in the post-Scream world is in the 90s, people were kind of embarrassed of slasher films. You had to be referential and, doing the Scream thing and poking fun at it because people didn't really want to deal with basically an actual natural slasher film. So this whole kind of conservative way of doing horror films didn't really make for great horror. I mean, the 90s are not really known for great horror movies. You do have some big classics like Cube and The Blair Witch and probably a bunch of others that people put in the comments and get mad at me about, but for the most part, not so much great ones. And so when you're dealing with kind of the legacy of Halloween and that film and trying to do it in a 90s setting with the only Halloween film with really star power behind it, not saying Jamie Lee Curtis isn't in the newer one, but this one was really sold on Jamie Lee Curtis above Halloween H20, and then 20 years later. This had a terrible title, by the way. And also, anytime I bring up the sequels, people always laugh and go, remember H2O, which has nothing to do with water. I don't even think people drink water in this, or it rains. I get, marketing wise, I would love to be in that meeting where they're Halloween 20 years later. What do we call this? What should the tagline? They're just Halloween 20 years later. Oh shit. I feel this film is very kind of safe in what it's doing. It doesn't want to go too far. It doesn't want to deal with the evil of Michael Myers. It's a little more concerned with Laurie Strode than Michael Myers. Originally, Jamie Lee Curtis tried to put this together and said it was I tried to do it with the best of intentions, but it didn't work out. She couldn't get John Carpenter back, depending on who you ask. Most people say it's because he asked for too much money because he felt like he was owed a lot of money by Mustafa Akkad, and other people say it's because, and this one I actually think might be true and upsets me more, is that he didn't just want Halloween H20 to direct that. He was if I do that, I want a 3-picture deal so I can make more movies with Dimension in the 90s, which if you're John Carpenter, that makes sense, and they were no, we don't want to do that. It's dude, really? John Carpenter's I want to make 3 movies for you. And they were no, I'm not interested. I don't know what those 3 movies were, but one of them probably was Ghosts of Mars, so I can side with them on that. But the Weinsteins and Dimension chose not to do that. This is the Weinsteins and Miramax sort of own H2O. They even have the latest one is Miramax, but the Weinsteins are not involved in Miramax anymore and haven't been in a long time, so don't worry about that. But they were involved in this, and this is done in very much the Dimension kind of Weinstein-y kind of way of making horror movies. The cinematography isn't really that great. It's kind of shot in that kind of Miramax-y kind of teen movie / horror movie kind of way, where it's oh cool, you move the camera around on the tripod. Neat. They never really wanted to really get into Halloween. They were more focused on the Laurie Strode character, who they age up maybe too much. I know a lot of people were saying, well, Jim, people had kids younger then, and that's why she could be in her mid to late 30s and have a 17-year-old and be the headmistress of a school. I am in that age range. I'm not as old as Laurie Strode is in this, but this did make me feel super old. But I don't know anyone in that age range who's a headmistress of a prestigious posh boarding school. They really never get into the logistics of the school, which I sort of think this film should have, because there's a lot of times I'm so they all live there, but your kid lives with you because you live on campus, but them going to Yosemite because they finally got out, but they don't deal with their parents. They live on this campus in this boarding school thing in California. We still have boarding schools like that. I don't know, whatever. I understand time-wise, in time that had gone by at that time, it was 20 years later. But in this movie, it felt 30 years later, which I don't really understand what they were doing with that. But anything to do with the Michael Myers stuff, it felt like she was just scared it was going to happen. There was a lot hey, when this goes down, it's going to be crazy. And when they get to those parts, it sort of does. Early on, they have things Michael Myers needs to steal a car from a mom and a little girl. And it's I don't really want to see little girls get murdered. Not into that. But why have that situation? The whole situation is he steals the mom's keys from the bathroom and then he walks out. and she's like, oh, thank God I didn't get like murdered. Also, my car's gone shit. And presumably your credit card. That sounds like an awful situation with a kid in the middle of nowhere. I would see the independent film about what happened to that lady. But kind of like not really what I'm interested in a Halloween film, and not like this unspeakable like boogeyman kind of evil to sort of just go like, I don't know, it's a mom and a kid, I'm just gonna let this one go. I mean, like, seriously, like, they're gonna report that car missing. Like, it just doesn't work within like Michael Myers' whole thing. And it just felt like a very 90s thing, like, hey, we have our limits. And it's like, fine, but like this whole situation is fucked. Like, why was it written this way? It's awful. And that kind of goes to like Jamie Lee Curtis said, like, she tried to do it with the best of intentions. She tried to bring people back. I don't know why Deborah Hill wasn't involved. I read nothing about Deborah Hill trying to be involved. She said it ended up her just doing it as a paycheck gig and not being kind of like this awesome kind of, hey, everybody's back to do a Halloween movie with Laurie Strode and things like that. And that's kind of the way it is throughout it. Like, it just feels like very Dimension Studios kind of movie. That's basically what it is with Halloween. Hey, we have the rights to Halloween. There's like the one great moment is Laurie Strode face to face through that like porthole thing in the door of I think that's what you call it, between Michael Myers and her. That was great. But there's problems with Michael Myers in that mask looks awful. It is the worst looking mask. I'm not a person who like really gets into that stuff, but like that is a bad looking mask. Like, I don't know what the deal is with that. Like, who made that? It doesn't look like a William Shatner mask painted white. It looks like somebody just got a stupid, like, they were like, what if we redesign the mask, make it look more 90s or something. It looks like too sheen, and like the eye holes dip down too much. Like, it's like the eye holes are like this big, and I liked it when you couldn't really see his eyes, and you can clearly see his eyes. It just looked awful in that. It doesn't really do much with like these people being like sort of more self-aware. It does, like, the kids don't talk like kids for the most part, particularly the couple who aren't Michelle Williams and Josh Hartnett. They just talk in like Kevin Williamson non-teen speak, which I've always really hated. It's like so unnatural. It's like, it's not that Preston Sturges had natural dialogue, but there was a rhythm to it. This just feels like a 40-year-old screenwriter getting teens to speak. Josh Hartnett plays Jamie Lee Curtis, or Laurie Strode's son. There's not really much they do with like her having a son. I think like the daughter thing works a lot better, and it's like they clearly had nothing to say with that. Him and his girlfriend Michelle Williams, like, way before she was like good and stuff. Like, she's really not good in this at all. It's more like she was like, hey, I'm on Dawson's Creek and stuff. Although I love Michelle Williams and she's great in almost everything, but like, she didn't really have much to do in this either, so, you know, whatever. Their teen subplot thing doesn't really work because they're trying to do Laurie Strode's thing and how Michael Myers gets there, and LL Cool J being an erotic fiction writer who also like is security for this school who logistically we don't understand. That's like, I don't know. There's just like too many things to get to it, and the teen plot line, which I'm assuming they're like, we'll get the teens in, and it's like, why don't you just get the people who like Halloween? Like, what the fuck? Like, the whole thing with like rich teens like wanting to get drunk in the basement is like, sure, I just don't really have that much of a connection to it. But the thing with Laurie Strode and Michael Myers is probably the best part of it. It, connection wise, other than the recent Halloween reboot thing, has probably one of the better screenplays, I'd say. It like connects together a little better. It's still not good. Like, enjoyment wise, like, I probably had more fun with 4 recently, or 2, and this kind of works a little better, but it doesn't have the highs that those films have. Like, the highs of this is like her and Michael Myers face to face, or her like deciding not to go into the closet. I thought that was clever, and then Michael Myers, she runs away. Michael Myers does try to find her in the closet, and she sneaks up behind him with a fire extinguisher. That was cool. I like that kind of stuff, but they didn't really have enough with like Jamie Lee Curtis or Laurie Strode kind of learning from what happened last time. But it's clearly like a place of love trying to do H2O, or at least that's how it started. But it sort of feels like the demands of Mustafa Akkad and the Weinsteins sort of took over this, and that's kind of like what they were all known for, is like, you know, needlessly like having control over these things and not thinking of like maybe the artistic merit of it. Granted, this has like the lamest title ever, which is Halloween 20 years later, so they're really leaning into the fact like, hey, we're back 20 years later. Get it? Okay, but it's like they don't really get to like, you know, you're really stuck in the school with him. They don't really play with that as much. It's interesting to have Jamie Lee Curtis be, you know, have an alcohol problem and have post-traumatic stress, and, you know, her being in kind of this witness protection thing. They're all kind of like interesting ideas that they don't really do enough with, you know. I understand it like retcons basically. 1 and 2 count, everything else doesn't. It's sort of like, doesn't retcon as much as the latest one, but it retcons pretty much 3, 4, 5, and 6. Particularly because it uses the same way she like died supposedly at the beginning of 4 through a car accident. This time they have her fake her death, and they were actually going to have it connected. Kevin Williamson, I believe it was him, had a scene where a kid, I think it's the girl who's not Michelle Williams, whatever her name is, that she read a book report basically, or read a report about the babysitter murders, and talks about Laurie Strode and how she has a daughter and what happened to that daughter, kind of acknowledging like, Laurie Strode went off and had this son, but her daughter was stuck behind or something, which is like, I think would have been sort of nice to have, you could have actually connected that continuity with H20 in Halloween Resurrection, but hey, Busta Rhymes I guess is a better choice, so whatever. Just the 90s-ness of this kind of overpowered it, and I think that's kind of true with a lot of these, like, oh, we can't do a horror movie because, things have changed. It's the 90s. Better and, more grown up or something as the immature kind of slasher films. And I don't think that really, like, made for good horror movies. It just, like, kind of made for, like, people, like, thumbing their noses at what was happening before. And I don't think that's just, like, sort of boring. Like, I don't really care about that. I actually saw this film at a preview screening. I got a pass to see it. I saw it, like, no one I saw it with, like, liked the original Halloween, which was disappointing. I remember watching it and going like, for like the sequel, it's one of the better sequels, I guess. It's like maybe on par with 2. I feel like it really isn't. It's like way lower to me because it just doesn't have like the big moments of it. Like, this isn't as entertaining because it's dealing with all these issues. It's not as crowd pleasing, and I think it sort of gets too involved in like trying to do these like dramatic character beats, which frankly it's not very good at, and not as being concerned with being a horror movie. Like, it's like the thing with the mom in the bathroom. That's very typical of this movie, where it's like, well, what are you even doing with this? Like, what's the point of this setup? Like, why is she in a boarding school in California? Why isn't he in Haddonfield? Like, what was this nonsense? And it like doesn't really ever answer itself. He's going after Laurie Strode. He's like goes into the original nurse's house and goes through a folder because he's been like, they never found his body from the explosion of the hospital in 2, but then where has he been? Like, it's just like too many things. You're like, how is this whole setup even happening? And it just kind of doesn't really do that. It's sort of like, I don't know, it's Halloween 20 years later. Like, come on, Laurie Strode's back. I think the mystique of Laurie Strode is she's like the greatest final girl, and she's the greatest like kind of like scream queen, like slasher victim of all time, and she won't go away until like Jamie Lee Curtis dies. And I think in this is like to honor kind of her and honor what she had achieved since leaving the franchise, basically. Having her mom, Janet Leigh, do a cameo, have a lot of very obvious references to Psycho and Halloween, which were like really groaning. But I liked how she was in front of the car that she used in Psycho, and then the music played. But I love that like I only knew that because I saw like a making of. But the reason like people, I saw this in theaters with people and they didn't recognize the car is because Psycho is in black and white and this movie is in color. So it takes you a moment to go, oh, that's what it looks like? Is that the car? I mean, I guess it is. That's right, because she's in front of it. So that's the car, right? This was apparently the first film Janet Leigh had been in since The Fog, which also was with Jamie Lee Curtis, which was a much better movie. It was kind of sort of like a total mess of a movie, really. I think this like feels like, the 90s trying to do a more mature, like, look, she's moved on and become a successful businesswoman and she has a son and all this stuff. But it's like, yeah, but like, how does that connect to any of these themes? How does that connect to her as a character? Like the post-traumatic stress and the alcoholism thing, I think works. I think Jamie Lee Curtis does a great job. She's very good in this role. She'd done True Lies 4 years earlier, and she was a more successful kind of name actress, and she like brings that to this role and was also able to do Laurie Strode really well. And she's very much playing the Jamie Lee Curtis movie star persona. She has the Jamie Lee Curtis kind of haircut, not the Laurie Strode haircut. This movie kind of falters under being like the only Halloween that's like a star vehicle for, not Michael Myers or something. And it's interesting to go from 3 movies that had Michael Myers in the title to, one that has Jamie Lee Curtis above the title. And there's kind of like the star vehicle vein of Halloween, but they sort of like don't get, the main part of Halloween is the experience and the intensity of it. And I feel like in this, like the part where it like actually gets to like what the meat and potatoes of a Halloween movie is, which is, Michael Myers stabbing people. When you get to that part of this movie, it just doesn't really work that well. The gore's not great. They have certain moments like when Michael Myers stabs her boyfriend and he like is like flailing around and stuff. I thought that was actually like, hey, I'm in a Halloween movie. For the most part, it's like skirting around the issue because it doesn't really want to go as like intense as the Halloween films, and not even through suggestion really. It doesn't even do the suggestion thing that well. It doesn't even get into the heart of evil with it. It's mainly like Jamie Lee Curtis in this situation trying to survive, you know, the Michael Myers thing. It's an interesting idea, but it's an interesting idea that just sucks. I think Kevin Williamson, his whole idea of like, you know, being more self-aware and understanding like 90s kids were more media savvy and understood slasher films and would analyze things like that, worked better in Scream. This just feels like he's trying to do that, but not really, and trying to do things with Laurie Strode and where would she be and trying to be clever about it, but it's not that clever. It just is almost like too much going in this totally different vein and not really getting what a Halloween movie was. So it's like, in some ways, like, yes, in a way, like this movie is a lot better and sort of like better constructed and things, but it's like better for what and for who, and for frankly who cares in the end. So if you have seen Halloween H20 20 years later and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.